within just the last 20 minutes, as we were getting ready to come on the air, you had Pfizer officially asking for the green light for emergency authorization for little kids and the vaccine. Up until now, you know, a missing piece of the puzzle and a potentially huge step in the fight against COVID. We'll talk about what parents need to know coming up. And in North Carolina, a chemical fire burning out of control. Thousands of people are having to evacuate because of a possible explosion. And fire crews can't even get close to the scene to fight it right now. We're going to show it to you live. Plus, winter is here, sure, but when the deep freeze comes to a place like Texas, it can be a nightmare. And that's the forecast for this weekend, with millions of people in the path of a huge ice storm. We'll check out those weather maps in a minute. And for the first time in weeks, we are finally hearing directly from Vladimir Putin himself about that military buildup on the border of Ukraine. What he is, and maybe as importantly, what he is not saying, and why the UK Prime Minister calls the whole thing a clear and present danger. Plus, you know, companies are desperate to slow down the so-called Great Resignation. So now, some of them are giving workers a piece of the pie. We'll explain how in tonight's original later on in the show. We start tonight with some, frankly, much-needed good news on the COVID front, because just in the last, 20, 30 minutes, we had Pfizer requesting this emergency use authorization from the FDA for its vaccine for kids under 5. It means the vaccine could be available potentially here by the end of February. Would require 2 doses. And listen, if you're a parent, you know this. This is the only game in town for kids 6 months to 5 years old. It would be the first. Pfizer, in a release tonight, pointing out about the request that more than 10 million children have tested positive for COVID in this country, and that kids under 4 account for more than 1.6 million of those cases. Let's bring in NBC's Tom Costello, who's following this breaking news for us. Tom, this is a big deal. I don't have to tell you, as a parent myself, my parent text chain, is blowing up over this. All the group chats are excited about this news. Can you explain specifically what is Pfizer asking for and what's the timeline here?
Well, here's a real interesting twist. Pfizer only submitted this request for emergency use authorization because the FDA asked Pfizer to submit the request. Because the FDA is saying, listen, we need to expedite this process. We can't wait to see the research on the efficacy of 3 doses. We know 2 doses should at least start that age group towards some form of having immunity against COVID-19. And so we want to start this now. We want to start the approval process now. So on the FDA's request, the Pfizer did go ahead and submit a request for emergency use authorization. Now, the FDA has set February 15th, 2 weeks from now, for that first meeting with the outside advisory committee to begin analyzing the data. Is, in fact, this 2-dose regimen, is it safe for kids under the age of 5? The dose, keep in mind, is 1/10 of the dose that you and I get, that adults get. But is it safe? All the data suggests so far it is safe. But then what about that 3rd dose that many people believe kids need to give them full immunization? Well, the research isn't there yet. They want to start this process as the research continues on that 3rd dose because they want to start this entire immunization process. We got 100,000 kids were in hospitals with COVID 2 weeks ago. 100,000. I mean, it's a very high number, and it's even higher among younger kids than teenagers. So the FDA and pediatricians believe that they've got to move fast on this. But I talked to one of the top pediatricians you've seen often, Dr. Paul Offit, who's on the outside advisory committee, and he says, listen, we are not going to approve this unless we are absolutely convinced it is safe for our kids and our grandkids.
That message, I think, Tom, cannot get hit home enough here when you look at the landscape of parents who might be vaccine hesitant right now. There's this new analysis from the Kaiser Family Foundation that says only 18.8% of kids are now fully vaccinated. About 28% have gotten the first shot, according to federal data. But there is some concern, I know, from experts that you've talked to, that I've talked to, that some parents may be a little bit nervous, right, about giving their kids this vaccine, even though pediatricians that we've talked to, doctors, have said this is a huge and potentially important step in the fight against this pandemic.
Yeah, and the other point here is that, mRNA technology, which is the technology used in this vaccine with Pfizer and also Moderna, they're not injecting you with any portion of a live virus. Right. And that's the difference, right? This is a cutting-edge technology, which is essentially telling your body how to respond to the virus without injecting you with the virus, and it's proven to be very effective. But you're right. I mean, listen, the Kaiser Family Foundation also found that only 31% of parents with kids under the age of 5 are going to get their kids vaccinated right away. Quite a few are going to wait to see how it is treated, how it's handled among the larger childhood population. And some are saying, no, we're not going to vaccinate our kids at all because we're not concerned about it. All right. But again, 100,000 kids in the hospital 2 weeks ago, 3.5 million kids had tested positive for COVID just last week. And can I make the point? A lot of parents and a lot of doctors are saying, listen, we don't know what the long-term effects of COVID are, right? We know that most kids get over it quickly, but we don't know about long-term debilitating effects in the lungs, in the brain, in the entire respiratory system. And as a result, we do need to vaccinate kids.
This decision point may be coming up real quick, Tom, timeline-wise. You mentioned, I think it was February 15th, right, that one of the FDA panels will be looking at this. Does that mean we are on track potentially for people to have their kids under 5 get vaccinated maybe in March? Or are we looking at a longer time frame?
Assuming that the FDA and then the CDC approve it, assuming that it all goes as planned, then yes, we could see shots in arms of young kids by early March 1st, somewhere in there.
Tom Costello with that breaking news for us. We'll look for more of your reporting tonight on Nightly. Tom, thank you for jumping in front of a camera for us. Appreciate it. To Winston-Salem, North Carolina now, where a huge fire is burning out of control at a fertilizer plant as we speak. There's real concern it could cause an explosion any second. Look at this. More than 6,000 people have had to leave their homes. They've been told, get out, get away from this. Firefighters want everybody in the area to stay as far from this as they can, calling this whole situation very volatile. Crews haven't even been able to get up closer to this fire today to fight it because it's just so risky. It's burning so hot and so fast. Here's why. There's a huge amount of ammonium nitrate inside. If you don't know what that is, it's a chemical that's used a lot in fertilizers and used in explosives, too. You've got all these people within a 1-mile radius told to leave. Nobody's been hurt so far, but there are still some real concerns tonight. I want to bring in Emily Aketa, who's following this story for us. Emily, what do we know about what happens tonight, overnight, into tomorrow for folks in this community?
Hey there, Hallie. So fire officials say they're going to continue to maintain that 1-mile evacuation radius, not just for residents, but also for firefighters. They say they're taking their cues from experts, people familiar with this ammonium nitrate substance, and they are indicating that the biggest risk should diminish by the morning. In the meantime, they're going to continue to be on high alert, take those precautions. Firefighters using drones and helicopters to monitor the fire, the size of the blaze for now, Hallie.
They're taking precautions for good reason, right? You heard the mayor of Winston-Salem make this comparison to what we saw as it relates to this fertilizer plant, to what happened at the West Fertilizer Company storage and distribution facility out in West Texas. That was back in April 2013. There's 3 times more ammonium nitrate in this plant than there was there, right? Luckily, this one's not deadly, right? At least at this point, nobody's been hurt, which is huge.
Yeah, absolutely. Another voice we're hearing from, the fire chief in that community. He's been on the job, he says, for more than 3 decades, and he's never faced a risk quite like this. Fortunately, the latest update, it appears that the size of the fire is beginning to reduce. But something that you have to keep in mind when it comes to this compound, ammonium nitrate, is that it's extremely unpredictable. And so there are a number of elements. Just a slight change could totally shift the course of this fire. So another reason why they have to remain on high alert. They're keeping people far from the scene. And you mentioned that Texas incident that essentially leveled an entire town just outside of Waco. When you're looking at the numbers, the fire chiefs today said that in that Texas plant, the fertilizer plant, it had about 240 tons of ammonium nitrate in the area. Well, in this North Carolina plant, the number is closer to 600 tons, Hallie.
You talked to, I think, in our team, one woman who lives in the area of this. She said she didn't even hear any emergency alerts or anything like that.
Yeah. And really, people were kind of getting the message through various ways, social media. But you can imagine just how terrifying of a situation this is for the community when you're woken up in the middle of the night, whether it be by an alert on Facebook or the sounds of sirens or the speakers, bright lights, and then also that smell of smoke. And not just the typical smell of smoke. This is more of like spent fireworks. And so people are then hearing of what's at stake, that they might not actually have a neighborhood to return home to. That fear is so palpable, and really it's easy to empathize. Here's one of the evacuees. Take a listen.
We don't know what chemicals we're breathing in. We don't know what's on fire. We don't know how dangerous it is. You know, long-term effects. We had no idea. I didn't even know there was a fertilizer plant, nor did I know that it had these dangerous chemicals.
The investigation into the cause of the fire still ongoing, Hallie. I will add that the plant was just inspected last December, and reportedly there were no issues. So a lot of questions still here. Hallie?
Emily, following all those developments for us tonight. Emily, thank you. If you thought the worst of winter was over, I hope you didn't think that just because it's February 1st, you're not going to get slammed. Get ready for this storm so big it stretches across 2,000 miles, 21 states, and is going to be bringing extreme snow and cold and pretty dangerous ice this week. Here's the maps. 85 million people are under these winter weather alerts from Colorado all the way to Vermont. This could be one of the worst storms for the Midwest in decades. And it could also be catastrophic for folks in the South. Why? Because of this ice storm. Places that aren't used to weather like that, places that aren't used to a quarter inch of ice, for example, in Dallas, Little Rock, etc. You had Texas's governor saying today they're going to utilize every state agency they can to try to respond to this storm. Bill Cairns is here with the forecast here. Bill, this feels like it could be a monster here, especially for folks in the Midwest.
Hallie, the rule of thumb is whenever it looks like our children have taken crayons to the weather maps, that's usually bad. The more colors, the worse.
Yeah, not great. And that looks pretty colorful behind you, friend.
Yeah, already, right? And it's only going to get worse. So, yeah, this is the map that shows you the 85 million people that are impacted. This is roughly about 25% of our country. Everywhere that you see the pinkish colors under winter storm warnings, the blue is under a winter storm watch, the white is with winter weather advisories. We don't have any ice storm warnings yet, but those will be coming later tonight and tomorrow. The storm hasn't even started yet, but when we wake up tomorrow morning, that's when it begins. From Oklahoma City to St. Louis, that's when the ice storm will begin for you. The green on this map shows you rain. The blue shows you where it's snowing. Okay. The pink is the ice. Some people don't mind the snow. Everybody hates the ice. And so here's how it plays out. That icy line right in the middle starts to head towards Dallas late Wednesday night, all the way to St. Louis. And then the snowstorm. This will be an epic snowstorm from St. Louis to Chicago, northern Indiana. And then I paused to the map at midday Thursday. That's kind of the peak of the storm. Notice that we have freezing rain and ice from Dallas to Austin, Little Rock. You know, we're talking southern cities that don't deal with this that often. That's why it gets to be a huge ordeal. And then this entire mess begins to slide east by the time we get into Friday. So how much snow is everyone going to get? Well, we're not getting a ton of snow in areas like Texas and Oklahoma. We're more concerned with ice in these areas. We can deal with 1 to 3 inches of snow. Of course, Dallas being the exception. We don't want the snow there, but you're going to get more freezing rain than anything else. The really high snowfall totals, the ones that could end up historic, somewhere in between Indianapolis, Chicago, and St. Louis. I have Champaign in there, 12 to 16 inches. It's a huge snowstorm by Midwest standards, and that would be one of the top all-time biggest snowstorms in Champaign history. Also Detroit at 6 to 10. And then finally, ice, huge issue everywhere in this pink. And this is the ugly map, but this is like the color crayons I would have chosen. This is the problem. If you're in that bright pink, that could be a crippling ice storm, Hallie.
And the problem with that, obviously, Bill, ice gets on the roads, ice gets on the power lines, power goes out, it makes it tough to get around. There's I mean, that's the stuff that is really scary for folks who aren't used to dealing with ice, because even people who are used to dealing with a lot of ice, it's a sketchy, problematic thing.
Yeah, when you start to go days like that, it gets to be a big issue. And, you know, we could have people without power into the weekend. And then if it's cold behind it, then you get, you know, it was only about a year ago, Texas had that horrific ice storm and snowstorm, and then the cold outbreak behind it. We saw what happened in Texas. That's what we're hoping to avoid. And, Hallie, I do know that we do have to talk a little bit about the Northeast, because this is Friday's forecast for the Northeast. This one's a little more iffy, but we are going to have problems with snow, ice, and rain in the Northeast. Right now, the heaviest snows are more towards northern portions of the Northeast, not in the I-95 corridor, but we'll have to watch it. Still 3 days away. As of now, Friday, if you're traveling around New York City, keep an eye on that forecast, because it could get very messy and slippery.
I'm just glad you have a home cam. Bill Cairns, I'm sure I'll be seeing more of you from it over the next few days. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Appreciate it. Breaking tonight, a whole bunch of headlines around what's happening with the January 6th committee investigating the Capitol riot. And they all have one thing in common: former President Donald Trump. Starting with this afternoon, just a couple of hours ago, Republican leader Senator Mitch McConnell responding for the first time about what Mr. Trump said over the weekend, suggesting he would pardon people who are charged, plead guilty, convicted of crimes related to the Capitol riot. Senator McConnell wasn't all that into that idea. Watch.
My view is I would not be in favor of shortening any of the sentences for any of the people who pleaded guilty to crimes.
So some daylight, not altogether shocking, between Senator McConnell and former President Trump. We're also adding more names this afternoon to the list of people who are talking to congressional investigators on that January 6th committee, starting with probably the highest profile name so far. The head of the Oath Keepers, a guy named Stuart Rhodes. You see him here. He's pleaded not guilty to seditious conspiracy charges. He will testify tomorrow, according to his attorney. And then a different guy, former Pence aide, somebody named Greg Jacob. That's him there, testifying today. We don't know what he said or how in-depth he got related to his interactions and what he saw on and around that day with former Vice President Mike Pence. Leanne Caldwell is on Capitol Hill. Leanne, this is like news potpourri, right? Because there's a lot of headlines on this. And let me start with Senator Mitch McConnell, pushing back gently, I think is fair to characterize it, not as aggressively as some other Republicans have, on this idea that Donald Trump said, as we've talked about here on this show, and an idea to supercharge his base, I think, ahead of a potential 2024 run. He may pardon some of these people charged with January 6th related crimes. McConnell's basically saying, nah, I don't think that's a good idea. Is that the view in the broader Republican Party?
Yeah, well, Hallie, McConnell's tone, actually, when I first read the transcript, I didn't see what McConnell said. I wasn't there. And when I read it, I was like, oh, McConnell's being very light here. But looking at the video, his tone was very forceful, actually, for Leader McConnell. He's usually much more soft-spoken. So I was a little taken aback by that. And he seems to have the same position as other Republicans, at least in the Senate. We heard Senator Lindsey Graham over the weekend say that it was inappropriate for the former president to say that. We know that Lindsey Graham is close with Donald Trump. And there's a bunch of Senate Republicans who are working on this Electoral Count Act, which is related to what happened on January 6th with the vice president. And they have said that this is more reason to continue with trying to shore up this legislation. You do have the MAGA squad, though, in the House, who, of course, have been saying this for months, that these people in the charges January 6th, their sentences should be reduced or they should be let go. Hallie.
The idea that what we heard from the former president is adding some urgency to those Electoral Count Act reforms. You've also got this guy, Stuart Rhodes, Leanne, charged with a very serious crime. This is the first time, I believe, that the January 6th committee is going to be talking with somebody, or somebody will be appearing in front of them, who's been charged with such a serious crime. What is the expectation here? It feels like probably low. He could certainly go in and plead the fifth and avoid anything self-incriminating.
Yeah, and that's what we expect. But thinking about what the January 6th committee's goal is, they have a lot of goals, but central is they want to connect the dots and see how the former president and the White House worked with all these different forces leading up to January 6th. And so what they care about, as far as Stuart Rhodes is concerned, is if there was any communication with the White House when he was gearing up for that rally and that attack on that day. But we don't expect him to say much to the January 6th committee. He has this whole legal investigation that's ongoing. He is in jail. That's where he's going to be giving his testimony. So, in the two different cases, I don't know which one's more important, what he says the January 6th committee or this legal case against him by the Department of Justice.
Quick context here, Leanne, because this is a potpourri of things. Is it that the January 6th committee is ramping up their activity, that they are doing more and putting the pedal to the metal in recent days? Or is it more that we're just hearing about it publicly, or both?
I think it's a mixture of things. And honestly, I think that some of these stories are coming out in part because people who have spoken with the January 6th committee or are being subpoenaed by the January 6th committee, a lot of people are getting nervous. And so they are trying to set the agenda and do what they need to do. And that's why some of these stories are coming out and being broken in the news, because the January 6th committee is closing in on a lot of people. And I am told that it is costing these people a lot of money, Hallie.
I bet. Leanne Caldwell, thank you so much for your reporting on the Hill. Let's go to Russia now, where for the first time in more than a month, Vladimir Putin has something to say, about that massive military buildup along Ukraine's border. It happened not too long ago today when the Russian president accused the U.S. of ignoring the concerns of his country. And he's not backing down from what has been his big demand all along. He's always said this. He wants NATO to stop expanding to the east. That means no Ukraine. That is a non-starter for the U.S. and our allies. Now, Putin didn't get into a ton of detail, but the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, told our Andrea Mitchell, it kind of sounds like from Putin, business as usual.
No, I think it's a sign that we are still having ongoing discussions with the Russians.
I want to bring in Matt Bodner in Moscow, who, listen, you cover Vladimir Putin, you cover what's going on in Russia. The significance here is that he is finally, we just talked a couple nights ago, Matt, about how Putin has been behind the scenes. We haven't seen much of him publicly. We did today. What stood out to you?
Thanks, Hallie. Well, obviously, this is one of the most hyped Vladimir Putin press conferences possibly ever. Slightly disappointing, I got to say, but if you were a first-time Vladimir Putin viewer, you got a very nice abridged look at the classic list of grievances. We heard things such as basically NATO in the West is responsible for the current situation. We got a little bit of the paranoia that usually comes with it, though I have to say, at a certain point, you have to just assume Vladimir Putin really believes these things. So here's a taste. The entire crisis right now is somehow a U.S. plot to try to coax Russia, trap Russia into a war it doesn't want so that it could then be hit with even more sanctions. We then heard him kind of go into some musings about the implications of a Ukraine in NATO, saying, what if Ukraine gets so emboldened that it tries to retake Crimea by force? Is that going to draw NATO into a war with Russia or vice versa? He said, it seems like no one's ever thought about these issues. They have, but we can go into that another time. So we got a lot of that. But we also got some concrete stuff from him that we need to pay attention to. He said that he believes it is possible for there to be some kind of, renegotiation of European security if Russia's demands are taken into serious consideration. And he also said that he thinks that, this is possible. He doesn't know how. He's not ready to say. So he's very much leaving his options open, as usual. This is all very classic Vladimir Putin.
So why did you say, Matt, then, that this was, you felt in some ways, a disappointing appearance from Vladimir Putin? Explain that piece of it.
I was kind of hoping we'd get a little more insight into what way he's going to take this. But I think that he's playing for time. So this will he, won't he game, we're not anywhere near being done with it.
And other partners of the U.S. are noticing this. We heard from the UK Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who was over in Ukraine meeting with the Ukrainian president to say basically, hey, we have your back. We defend you against how the world sees Moscow's troop buildup. Here's what he had to say.
Somebody said, were we exaggerating the threat? Were the US and the UK in any way trying to big this up? And I've just got to say that is not the intelligence that we're seeing. This is a clear and present danger.
Clear and present danger is how he's describing it. This is a forceful international response, Matt. Do you get any sense that that is part of the reason why we saw Putin today come out and now sort of remind everybody, I'm here too, and here's what I think, here's my demands?
Not only that, I think that's definitely correct, but Vladimir Putin today is also showing us that he, too, can be a people person. So it's important to note this press conference was after a meeting with Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, one of Putin's kind of biggest supporters in the European Union, in NATO. Right before we got into all the NATO stuff, Putin announced a gas deal with Hungary, 15 years below market price. So that's the carrot. That's Putin reminding some of his customers in Europe, some of his friends in Europe that, we can give you good deals.
Matt Bodner, live for us there in Moscow tonight. Matt, great to have you. Really appreciate your insights. We're learning tonight more about the Supreme Court selection process for the Biden administration because, yes, it is officially the start of SCOTUS season. February 1st, President Biden's going to pick a replacement for retiring Justice Stephen Breyer, he says, by the end of the month. And now we know that former Alabama Senator Doug Jones is going to be what in Washington parlance people like to call one of the Sherpas, basically a guide to whoever this nominee is as they go through meetings on Capitol Hill, go through the interview and confirmation process, et cetera. They basically work to prep her, and I say her specifically because that President Biden has pledged to select a black woman as his pick to become the next Supreme Court justice. Comes as the White House has taken its first step today towards picking a nominee. You saw President Biden and Vice President Harris meeting these two that you see on the screen, these two senators, Chuck Grassley, top Republican on the Senate Judiciary Committee, Dick Durbin, top Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee, with President Biden making really clear what he's looking for. Watch.
What I'm looking for is a candidate with character, with the qualities of a judge in terms of being courteous to the folks before them and treating people with respect, as well as a judicial philosophy that is more one that suggests that there are unenumerated rights in the Constitution.
We also know that President Biden also called Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell today, with McConnell, according to his office, telling President Biden it's important for a nominee who believes in an independent judicial system, somebody who would resist any political pressures. Up next, some breaking news coming into us. Brian Flores, fired as coach of the Miami Dolphins after the season, now filing a federal lawsuit against the NFL. We're going to explain why. And some of the NFL legends, including Bill Belichick, whose name is in the filing, and a mistaken text message. How this all plays in. We're going to talk about that in a sec. We got some breaking news into us tonight. Former Miami Dolphins head coach Brian Flores accusing the NFL and its teams of racism in a new class action lawsuit. Flores, who's black, says the New York Giants put together a, quote, sham interview for their head coaching job. He also accuses Dolphins owner Stephen Ross of tampering and accuses Denver Broncos general manager John Elway of misconduct in a 2019 interview. NBC News, we should note, has not gotten any statements from these teams or the NFL about this lawsuit, at least not yet. I want to bring in NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos. And Danny, let me read from this class action complaint where Flores' lawyer says he wanted to, quote, shine a light on the racial injustices that take place inside the NFL and to effectuate real change for the future. The context is really important here because this is a league, Danny, that's about 70% black. And right now there's only one black head coach in the NFL after Flores' firing. There's no black owners. What stands out to you from the accusations that Flores is making here?
Oh, this complaint shines a light, all right, and not just on Flores' situation, but the history of alleged discrimination in the NFL. And everyone gets hit by the shrapnel, it seems. Bill Belichick has some cringeworthy moments or appearances in his text messages. So, too, are the allegations against John Elway. Not flattering at all. Nobody is safe in this complaint. It takes no prisoners and sets out a lengthy allegations of history of discrimination in the NFL.
You mentioned Bill Belichick. The only reason Flores says he knows about that he got passed over for this job is because Bill Belichick apparently texted him 3 days before Flores' interview, apparently put in the wrong Brian, right? Because basically congratulating, saying the job went to Brian Dable, who is white, who is not black. The texts are in the lawsuit, right? We should note Flores, by the way, is still looking for a job. He says he knows he's risking that in a statement, but wants to stand up for systemic racism in the NFL. What's interesting here is he says he was then forced to sit through an interview knowing he didn't get the job. And he claims, according to this lawsuit, that, you know, they were taken the Rooney Rule, which is this NFL rule that says you have to interview at least one diverse candidate for the head coach position, you know, to an extreme degree here.
That's right. And the Rooney Rule, the complaint says, has been not only ineffective, it's gone backwards. When the Rooney Rule was implemented, allegedly there were, I believe, 2 or 3 NFL head coaches. Now there is one. So as the complaint puts it, we've gone backwards, not forward. And, the cringeworthiness of both Bill Belichick's text message where he accidentally got the wrong Brian and congratulated someone, and then the fact that allegedly this plaintiff sat through all those interviews knowing supposedly that the decision had already been made. But the key for him in this complaint is if he cannot show discriminatory intent, he's going to need to show enough of a discriminatory impact in order to make those allegations stick. Because the mere fact that there is an inequity does not necessarily lead to the conclusion legally that there is discrimination. So it's not a layup. It's not an easy. It's not a 1-yard field goal for this plaintiff. He's got to make and meet his burden.
Danny Savalos, we appreciate the football analogy. Thank you. As I was talking to Danny, we actually got a statement from the New York Giants here. I want to read it to you related to this lawsuit, literally just into us, saying, quote, "We are pleased and confident with the process that resulted in the hiring of Brian Dable. We interviewed an impressive and diverse group of candidates. The fact of the matter is, Brian Flores was in the conversation to be our head coach until the 11th hour. Ultimately, we hired the individual we felt was most qualified to be our next head coach." A lot of football news today. Right, that's one piece of it. That's one piece breaking now. There's another football story. I am willing to bet $1,000 you probably have heard about by now. Tom Brady putting to rest this whole will he or won't he thing, right? Saying he is going to retire. He's going to be walking away from the NFL after 22 years of, to his credit, rewriting the record books. He's 44 years old, and for the first time ever, he's talking about his career in the past tense, saying he'll focus his time on other things. He'll leave it up now to the next generation of players. You may be like, wait a second, didn't I already hear that Brady retired over the weekend when ESPN broke that story? Yes, but at the time, the 7-time Super Bowl champ was sort of downplaying it, going on podcasts, having his dad come out and say, no, he hasn't made up his mind. Today, Tuesday, he has. Brady leaves the NFL with the most wins, the most touchdowns, the most passing yards, the most completions, and 7 Super Bowl rings. And if you know me as an Eagles fan, you'll know how hard it was for me to choke that sentence out without crying. Let me bring in Morgan Chesky now. And Morgan, there are some words that are not part of Brady's retirement announcement, and that's New England Patriots, right? He's leaving, playing for the Bucks, but I think everybody knows him as a Pats guy, no?
Right. And I mean, Hallie, this was a lengthy Instagram post that dropped this morning. Of course, everybody was waiting for official word from Tom himself on his future. Yesterday, he says in a podcast, I'm still considering all options right now. And so for him to put this out, just page after page of thank yous to the Buccaneers organization, to head coach Bruce Arians, to the Glazer family who owns them, to all of his teammates, not a mention of not just New England, but the Patriots organization, no mention of Robert Kraft, no mention of Bill Belichick. He did say thank you to all the great teammates I've played with. But, yeah, that is a pretty big omission. It does beg the question, how intentional was it? We do have to remember that whenever he left New England 2 years ago, he gave a lengthy thank you to the New England Patriots, to everyone affiliated with that program, to the fans, to everyone he said believed in him when nobody else did. So you could think that he was giving the Buccaneers their due since he has spent the past 2 years there and he won a Super Bowl with them. So it's up to interpretation, but no doubt a notable omission from a retirement message that everyone was kind of waiting for.
Listen, a huge, significant retirement message for fans of football or fans of, like, the cultural zeitgeist more broadly, something that Tom Brady has been a part of for years now. He's an athlete, but he's also a businessman. He's got other irons in the fire as it relates to what he might do next, right?
He absolutely does. And in fact, on one of the last slides in his retirement message, he says that he is excited about, taking steps to consider what his next business opportunities will be. Of course, he already has that TB12 brand that's incredibly well known in the sports world. And he also has other investments in other arenas right now that we'll likely see, if he stays off the field and does venture more into business, he'll certainly lean into in the coming months and years ahead. That said, there is still a lingering question here, Hallie. I actually put a poll on my Instagram page earlier asking people, do you believe that, announcement or not, Tom Brady's actually done playing football? And about 75% of people say yes, but a quarter of the folks still see that this isn't the last we're going to see of 12. Time will tell. It was an extensive retirement message today. Yeah. But this is also Tom Brady. Heck of a competitor here. He's the GOAT. So we'll see.
I know. I mean, he did, Giants fans who produced this segment would point out he had a Super Bowl defeat, right? He's had some. Eagles fans would point that out,
Not one, but two, of course.
Right. Listen, I admire your initiative in putting out that poll on your Instagram. It might not meet the scientific methodology for NBC News standards, but listen, it's a data point, and I appreciate you bringing it to it. Morgan, love talking sports with you, friend. Thank you for being here with us. Coming up here on the show, more bomb threats targeting historically black colleges and universities, even more than we first told you about last night. Ken Delanian has more in just a second on how seriously schools should be taking this. And have you heard about this? Whoopi Goldberg catching some heat for saying the Holocaust was, in her words, not about race. Her apology coming up in the 5 Things. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, a student has been killed in a shooting at a high school outside Minneapolis. A second student is in critical conditions. The suspects haven't been found yet, but the FBI is helping police with that investigation. We'll watch that too. Number 2, at least 24 people have been killed after serious rain triggered floods and landslides in Brazil. More than 1,500 families have been forced out of their homes. Dozens are still missing. Rescue teams are looking for survivors. Number 3, Whoopi Goldberg says she's sorry for saying the Holocaust wasn't about race. Those are comments she made on The View yesterday and then apologized for in a tweet after getting a ton of backlash. The hosts of the show were talking about a school board's banning of the graphic novel Mouse when Goldberg made that remark. Number 4, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is being called out for not condemning Nazi demonstrations. It happened near Orlando over the weekend. He says political opponents are trying to smear him, quote, as if he had something to do with it. At a press conference, DeSantis said people should not have gathered for that. It happened at an overpass. Number 5, Native American tribes have reached a $665 million settlement in an opioid lawsuit. Johnson & Johnson and the country's 3 biggest drug distributors will pay tribal communities devastated by the drug crisis. Money from the deal will go toward addiction, treatment, and rehab. Students and staff want answers. Some of them want answers from the FBI after yet another round of bomb threats at more than a dozen HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities. And the timing here, the first day of Black History Month, for a second day in a row. Schools from Delaware down to Louisiana. Look at them on the map here. They've all gotten bomb threats on campus, forcing students, teachers, et cetera, to shelter in place. No bombs have been found on campuses. And listen, the threats aren't new. This is the second round of them. 8 of the most popular HBCUs got threats in early January, too. Ken Delanian is joining us now for more on this. Ken, so the FBI said it would start looking into this last month. In January, I should say, when those initial threats happened. Have they learned anything? Do we know anything more on this front here?
Hallie, the FBI and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms have said that they are looking into this matter in cooperation with local law enforcement. A law enforcement official told me that the same racist language had been used in some of these threats, but that they were still looking into whether this was the work of domestic extremists or just simply pranksters, because the reality is we don't always know what's happening with these bomb threats, but whatever the motive, they are incredibly disruptive to students and professors.
We talk about canceling classes, right? Students should be in school. College kids go to college to learn. Talk about the drain that this puts on schools' resources, on local law enforcement agencies' resources when threats like these come up.
Yeah, an incredible drain. Each of these campuses had to be swept, completely swept, to make sure there were no bombs. And there usually aren't any bombs. Let's face it, these threats often don't lead anywhere. But it's essentially, it's a form of terrorism. I mean, their classes were disrupted, and especially given the historical context here, Hallie, which we all know, in which bombs were used to kill black people, this really is a form of terrorism, whatever the motive.
Ken Delanian live for us on that front. Ken, thank you so much for staying on top of that story. We're going to hope, obviously, that those threats diminish ASAP. Thanks, Ken. It is a terrifying time to be a journalist in Mexico after the killing of a 4th journalist in just a month. Roberto Toledo, who worked with a news outlet called the Monitor Michoacan, was shot and killed Monday by 3 men. He now joins 3 other reporters who were killed in January, just January alone. You see their names on the screen here. Jose Luis Gamboa, Margarito Martinez, and Lourdes Maldonado Lopez. One of the most disturbing things about this, Toledo was actually in a federal protection program for journalists. That's what the risk level is like here. There, I should say. Gadi Schwartz is joining me now. Gadi, I think that this is such an important story to shine a light on here because we are just barely into the 2nd month of the year. 9 journalists died in Mexico last year. What is going on that makes journalists there so vulnerable?
Well, Hallie, to be honest, it really comes down to what is almost complete impunity. All 4 of those murders are often at the hands of several killers. And so far, we have seen 0 arrests. And the brutal reality is it's not just the murders of journalists that go unpunished. It is most murders that happen in Mexico, period. This latest one that you just mentioned, Roberto Toledo, was shot by 3 gunmen in Zitácuaro, where he reported for that local news agency. And again, 95% of crimes against journalists are never prosecuted, which is about the same as the overall rate of prosecution across the country. One think tank estimates that only 2% of killings that are reported are prosecuted, and those are just the ones that are reported. Those are the ones that we're talking about right now. Whereas today, there are still 15 journalists that are missing in Mexico, and all of it's prompting protests as people are demanding more protection be given to those that are risking their lives to expose corruption.
Okay, so a couple of questions here. We talked about how Toledo was in this federal program to protect journalists. One of the other journalists who was killed last month was also in this program. You look at those data points, Gadi, and it's hard not to ask the question, is it not working? Like, what is wrong with this program that it is not having the intended effect of protecting these people?
Yeah, for many, it is clearly not working. There was another journalist, Lourdes Maldonado. She was also in the program. They call it The Mechanism in Mexico, and she enrolled in 2020. She actually stood by the president at one point talking about how she feared her life. She was not receiving the protection that she was promised when she was shot and killed right outside her home. She said before she was killed that she was afraid specifically of walking into and out of her house after work and out of her house going to work. And the government was supposed to offer her a panic button. They were supposed to offer her routine patrols and offer permanent protection from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m., but she did not get that protection. And she was also gunned down by 3 men right in front of her home.
So
Hallie?
Where is the president on this? Because the spokesperson condemned the latest killing, but you talked about the just completely upsetting rate of unsolved murders here. What are they doing from a leadership perspective in Mexico to make sure this doesn't keep happening?
To be frank, Hallie, it's a cycle that we see happen over and over again. The president and political leaders in Mexico say that this cannot continue, that this is heinous, and that they will investigate this to the fullest extent of the law. But again, 2% of murders in Mexico, according to one think tank, are prosecuted. That's 2% of all murders. We're talking about over 33,000 murders a year. And so the journalists that are in Mexico right now are saying they are demanding protection, but at the same time, a lot of what's being lost in the cracks is that a lot of these journalists are deciding that, look, do I want to report on things that are going to get me killed when there is no repercussion for somebody to kill me? And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, it's a cost-risk analysis that journalists are having to make. Hallie?
Gadi Schwartz, I'm so glad that you're bringing the story to us tonight. I really appreciate you staying on top of it. Thank you. Coming up after the break, we know more Americans are quitting their jobs than ever before. And guess what? The bosses are finally paying attention. Vicky Nguyen explains how some businesses are trying to keep on those workers on the payroll in tonight's original. Plus, the show must go on. Elton John back on tour after getting COVID. We've got those details next in the local. Well, more people are quitting their jobs than ever before. Some businesses say they've got a little secret to try to keep their employees around. Vicky Nguyen reports on this for us in tonight's original. But first, NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day. And because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our West Coast Bureau, California's making moves to close the country's largest death row. Governor Gavin Newsom announcing all death row inmates at San Quentin State Prison will be moved to general population at other prisons. The state wants to transform that whole spot for rehab and for education instead. From our Southeast Bureau, a Florida Senate committee has approved a bill to make protesting outside of people's homes illegal. Lawmakers mentioned things like anti-mask protests before voting unanimously on this. It makes protesting outside of somebody's house a misdemeanor. Could cost you $500 and 60 days behind bars. And from our Midwest Bureau, Elton John's Chicago concerts will go on as planned. We told you last week he had to cancel some of his shows in Dallas after getting COVID. Well, he'll pick back up with his farewell Yellow Brick Road tour this week at the United Center. Now to today's original with in-depth reporting on a topic we've been keeping an eye on. You know the Great Resignation? It is official. New data out today by the Labor Department says more than 47 million Americans quit their jobs in 2021. That is a record. That is the highest that number has been since keeping track of this whole number in the year 2000, right? So 22 years here. You, if you're watching this, maybe you're one of the people who was part of the Great Resignation. To put that number in perspective, in 2019, about 42 million people quit their jobs in this country. But some businesses, you may know, Publix grocery stores, Cliff Bar, they've got a strategy for trying to keep employees in the midst of all this historic turnover. Wait till you hear what it is. NBC News' senior consumer investigative correspondent Vicky Nguyen is here to explain.
Michael Aiken works for Johnny's Pizza House in Shreveport, Louisiana. He started as a high school junior in 2008, but after a few years, Michael received a statement on top of his normal paycheck confirming he owned a piece of the company.
And I saw that, oh, such and such amount of stock, and this is your cash value amount of your account. It was, oh, wow, I'm a part of something that's bigger than me. and I can watch something grow.
So how did it happen? Johnny's offers an ESOP, or Employee Stock Ownership Plan. Workers get a slice of the company after 3 years on the job. They can cash out when they leave Johnny's or save until retirement. Michael has now been there for 13 years. He trains employees and helps open new restaurants.
Well, how much of this ownership program played a role in you being there for so many years?
Well, I would say it played a definite role in it. More of your heart goes into your work because you see that statement.
There are 6,500 employee-owned companies in the U.S., names you'd recognize. Cliff Bar with just over 1,000 employees. W.L. Gore, they make Gore-Tex fabric with over 11,000 workers. The nation's largest ESOP, Florida-based Publix grocery stores with 225,000 employees.
Employee-owned businesses tend to have lower turnover and more loyal employees.
Joseph Blasi is a Rutgers professor specializing in employee ownership. A recent report shows these companies fared much better than non-employee-owned companies over the past 2 years. They retained workers at a rate of 4 to 1. Another study found employees at ESOPs had twice the amount of money in their retirement accounts, $132,000 on average.
Most ESOP companies also share cash profits every year with employees, typically in excess of 10% on top of wages.
According to Blasi, if you want to work for an ESOP, expect to be more involved in corporate matters and also share more business-related information with coworkers. And it takes commitment. Maximum wealth comes at retirement.
Some employees, especially in ESOPs, if they're younger, they don't want to wait until retirement to get that big wealth nest egg.
At Johnny's Pizza House, Michael's nest egg has been growing since 2008. The company's CEO tells NBC News multiple employees have retired, cashing out more than $1 million.
People might say, but you work at a pizza restaurant. How is this possible?
It's definitely possible as long as you're taking care of whoever comes through the door and taking care of the things in your four walls and you're making sure your customers are taken care of and coming back. I mean, it's going to work.
Vicky joins us now live. Vicky, thank you so much for bringing us this story. It's fascinating. I know a lot of people who might shop at Publix down in Florida or who might eat Cliff Bars who didn't know, hey, I didn't realize these were ESOPs. Are there specific types of businesses that typically make this kind of move?
Hey, Hallie, yeah, most of the time these are family-owned businesses, and at some point the owner says, you know what, it's time for me to get out. But they don't want to close it down, they don't want to sell it to a corporation, so they say, you know what, let's form one of these plans and sell it back to our employees who worked so hard to help build our success.
What kinds of questions, let's say you do want to work for one of these employee-owned companies and you're going to take a job with them, what should you be asking about as an employee?
Hallie, every business is different, but you definitely want to ask, when am I fully vested? Is there a minimum age for me to enroll? And just remember, they're a little bit like 401ks, so if you leave early, there can be tax implications.
Are people able to search if they specifically want to work for a company like this, where they are invested in the company's success? How do you find those kinds of jobs?
Well, right now in 18 states and the District of Columbia, where you are, Hallie, there are these things called Employee Ownership Resource Centers, so you can search for those and see what's available where you live.
Vicky Nguyen, love it. Thank you. It is news you can use. Love having you on the show. Appreciate it. We're going to stay on top of this struggle of both workers and business owners navigating this great resignation and how the pandemic's affecting the economy tomorrow night, too, when our Maura Barrett looks into how the restaurant industry is basically begging Congress for help after Omicron hit them hard. It's tomorrow night, right here on this show. Up next, we've seen the headlines about schools banning books over topics like race and sexuality, and the biggest battleground, maybe Texas. Antonia Hilton has exclusive reporting on how some librarians and students are trying to fight back. So we just got a couple of news statements in on the Brian Flores story we just told you about a few minutes ago. Remember, Flores suing the NFL and some teams for racial discrimination and alleged tampering. First, this in from the Miami Dolphins. The team says they vehemently deny any allegations, and the implication that they acted in a manner inconsistent with the integrity of the game is incorrect. We're also hearing from the NFL League office. They're saying, quote, diversity is core to everything we do, and that they will defend these claims, which they say that are, quote, without merit. I wanted to bring you that update before I move on. Now to a story you will only see here. Dozens of schools in Texas finding themselves at the center of a movement to ban books. Public schools there have collectively pulled hundreds of books after a surge of parent complaints, mostly about stuff dealing with race and sexuality and gender. including in Katy, Texas, where parents complained at a school board meeting a couple months ago. Check this out.
I cannot even imagine how I would feel if my child came home with this type of book.
How do these books get into our libraries? We need accountability from you as a board.
One parent in Katy even asked the district to take away a children's biography of Michelle Obama, arguing that that promotes reverse racism. Antonia Hilton has been following this story for us. She's got an exclusive airing tonight on NBC Nightly News. This fight in Texas, Antonia, boy, you got the Republican governor there, even calling for the potential for criminal charges against school staff if they give kids, certain young adult books, etc. Talk about how many districts this is happening as, what the school districts are doing on this front.
So, Hallie, what we found is about at least a dozen Texas school districts are part of this unprecedented trend, removing books that deal with race, gender, sexuality, and in some cases, removing them without even following their own district policies. So if a parent complains about a book, school district officials are supposed to be holding meetings, reading the books along with librarians, and having thoughtful discussions about whether or not they're appropriate for different grade levels. But in some cases, we found that in some Texas districts, parents complained, and then the books just went right off the shelves without any formal process in place. And yeah, this is all happening in the backdrop, of course, of the statement the governor made about potential criminal charges, and it's left librarians particularly fearful right now. They have told me and my colleague Mike Hicksonbaugh that they feel as though they are being forced to violate their own code of ethics, asked to do things in their jobs right now in different districts in regions all over the state that is making them highly uncomfortable, and some of them are even thinking about leaving the profession. Hallie.
Talk to me about what you're hearing from students. I know you talked with one author whose book was banned from a school district that declared his book on being queer and black as a child, quote, not appropriate at any level. What are you hearing from them?
Well, when you talk to students, especially students of color, LGBTQ students, they say that this has been really hurtful for them. Some of them have described a feeling like this has impacted their mental health, their relationship to their school, that they want to leave Texas as soon as they can graduate. And then I actually had a conversation with George M. Johnson, the author who you just mentioned there. They wrote a book called All Boys Aren't Blue. And in one section, about 4 or 5 paragraphs of a about 320-page book, they detail an experience with explicit sexual abuse. And that's really been at the center of the fight there. Parents saying that this description of abuse is not appropriate for kids of any age to read or learn about. George, however, really argues that there are many kids who experience the same things George went through and should see that life experience reflected in school. Take a listen to some of my conversation with the author.
When we start removing these books from public libraries, we cut off a lifeline for many students in many ways who need to be able to access these books to read about themselves and to learn about themselves.
George actually mentioned to me that, interestingly, in the last couple weeks, they've seen their book sales climb up, and that they think this movement is having the unintended effect of actually drawing kids' attention to the very books these parents don't want them to read. They're going online and ordering them.
You've seen that in some other instances recently, too. I think about what happened in Tennessee in that graphic novel Mouse on the Holocaust. Let me have you pull back for a second here, Antonia, because you cover this story feels a little like a battle in the broader culture war in Texas that you and Mike have been covering for a long time here. Is that a fair assessment? Is that a fair way to put it?
Absolutely. This is really the next stage in that same fight that we have been covering now for months. And, I think it's important to remember here what you mentioned, the governor calling for criminal charges against school staff members who give pornographic books to school children. And then also that a Republican state representative sent out a list of 850 books to all the school districts, asking them to investigate these books, to see if they had them on their shelves, and to review these books. And this is all part of that climate, the same political climate. I mean, in some cases, in some of these communities, there are organic groups of parents who are reading these books and talking about them. But there's also a movement here that is being pushed by conservative politicians, talked about very publicly, and all of these things are interconnected when it comes to the fight over critical race theory and how we talk about these tough subjects in schools, Hallie.
Antonia Hilton, we're so glad to have you preview this excellent reporting for us here tonight on NBC News Now. Thank you. We'll see more of you on Nightly News with Lester Holt, 6:30 Eastern on your local NBC station. That does it for us this hour. We're going to have more for you here tomorrow, same time, same place. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.